In this video, we're going to look at PowerShell Universal pages. Pages are simple drag and drop websites that can execute PowerShell scripts and REST APIs. So unlike dashboards in PowerShell Universal, you don't need to actually author any PowerShell script to create the UI itself. You can use the drag and drop designer, and then you can hook that up to your existing PowerShell scripts that don't necessarily need to know anything about Universal Dashboard. Pages don't quite offer the same amount of customization, but they're a lot easier to get started with. So in my PowerShell Universal instance here, I have a couple scripts defined. So you can see here I have a services script, a form script, and a button script. The services script just calls get service, so it's going to return all the services to the PowerShell pipeline, so we can use those in our pages. Then I have a form script. This does a lot more. It accepts a rating, so we're going to use a rating control to pass that in. Then it calls read host. Then it writes progress over 10 seconds. And then it calls get service and selects the name of all the services from get service. Then I have a button, and all this does is accepts a single value of value. Within my API section here, you can see I have three endpoints. First, I have a chart endpoint, and this just returns an array of hash tables with names and values that are randomly generated. Then I have a statistic, and that just returns a get random value between 100 and 1000. And then finally, I have a variable endpoint that returns a hash table with a description property set to let's load a description. So let's look at creating some basic pages. You can go to the user interfaces pages section to create new pages. To create a new page, click create a new page, and then we can name our page. So we're just going to call this basic. And this is just going to be a basic page. URL is not required, and the URL will be the name if you don't specify it. So we're going to click OK, and now you can see we have a basic page. To actually edit the contents of this page, what we're going to do is we're going to click the View button here. That's going to pop open the page itself, and this is kind of the view the user is going to see of this page. You can see there's nothing on this page right now except for some navigation on the left-hand side here, the title, and description of the page. But since I'm logged in as an administrator, what I can do is actually click this edit button here to edit the page. And now it switches into this edit mode where we have save, cancel, properties, the toolbox, and variables. So properties are the properties of the actual page itself. I can do things like changing the icon that's going to be shown up in the navigation. I can hide the navigation, show this page in navigation or not, and even hide the header at the top. We'll get into this data source when we do the variables section. So if I save this and click save, it's going to reload that page, and now you can see that my basic navigation has the little apple symbol there for the icon. So let's go ahead and add some components to this page. So when you click Toolbox, it's actually going to pop up the toolbox, and we have several different types of components that we can insert. We have charts, data display components like alerts, images, and tables, data input like buttons and forms, and then various types of typography like paragraphs and titles. So let's actually go ahead and insert a bar chart. So just click the bar button here to insert a new bar chart, and you're going to see that appear on the pages kind of like editor canvas, I guess. And each one of these components, you can see that has a little bounding box around it, and in the bottom right corner here, you can actually resize that component, and then if you just click and drag the component, you can actually move it around. So what I'm going to do with this particular component is click Properties here in the top right, and now we can specify all the properties for this particular chart. So since a chart is a data-driven component, we need to specify a data source. You can specify either a script or an API for a chart, and I'm actually going to specify an API. So I'm actually going to use my chart API that returns a array of hash tables, and we're going to use that data to populate the chart. So if we actually go to this required tab, now we can specify the properties that we're going to select for the x-axis and the y-axis of this chart. Additionally, there are some options for color and to include a scroll bar if you have lots of data. So we're just going to click Save. And what you're going to see here is our chart has loaded. It actually went out and called that our API, invoked that PowerShell script, and then populated this chart. You can hover over and see the values that were returned. If we actually click Save, it's going to kind of publish this page, and the end user would be able to load this page and view this chart. So there was no real coding that we had to do besides our PowerShell script. We just kind of drag and drop this chart onto our page. So one thing to note when creating components from data sources like this are the different ways that script and APIs work. So when you specify an API, every single time the page loads, it's actually going to call that API, invoke that API to populate the data of this chart. If you specify a script, it's not going to actually invoke that script every time. What it's going to do is it's going to get the last output of that script and display it inside the chart. So it's kind of one way to cache data in that regard. So now let's add another display component, which would be the statistic. So this is primarily for just kind of displaying just a number value inside a Ant Design card here. And if we click the properties of that, what we can do is we can change the title. I'm going to call this random, since I'm just going to call my random data source. From there I can select API, and we are going to use the stat API, which was returning that random value between 100 and 1000. So if we save that, you can see that the random value shows up inside of that statistic. Save this, and you can see the page reloads, and it populates these charts and statistics based on our APIs. So let's take a look at how to use a script. So if I click Edit again, I'm going to click Toolbox, Data Display, and we're actually going to use a table for this one. So I'm going to add a new table. I'm going to put that over here. I'm going to move this statistic down over here, and I'm going to make this table pretty big. So I'm actually going to use the services script to display data from that particular output of that script in the table. So again, this isn't going to run the script again. It's just going to get the output from the last time the script ran. So we're going to call this services, and we're going to set the data source to script this time, and we're going to select the services script. If you don't specify columns, what it's actually going to do is it's going to take all the properties and create a whole bunch of columns for you based on the object that it's returned. But with services, there's lots and lots of properties, and we don't want to do that. So what we're actually going to do is define some columns. So we do have two types of columns. I'm not really going to get into the button column, but that allows you to kind of invoke stuff or scripts based on the row. It's going to have a button show up in that column. But we're just going to use basic columns. So I want the name of the service to be shown, and I also want the status of this service to be shown. So we'll just do another basic, and we'll do status and status. So now we'll have two columns in our table. There's other things we can do, like refreshing the table on an interval. We can also allow the table to be exported, but I'm just going to leave those out for now and click Save. So now you can see that it's loaded up the table with all the different services that I have in my environment. And we have the name and the status of each one of those services. If I click Save, it's going to reload that page, and you can see that, again, we've loaded the data. Our APIs are changing because it's calling those over and over again pretty much. And our services are not, because it's just looking at the last output of that job. So we can actually, page through here. We can change the size of the page, that kind of thing, to view all of the services in our environment. So that's kind of the basics of using APIs and scripts to display data inside pages. But let's actually go ahead and create another page to input data. So I'm going to go back to my PowerShell Universal instance here, our admin console. Click Create New Page, and we'll just call this one Form, or Input, since we're kind of doing multiple inputs. I'll leave URL blank again and just click OK. So now we have another page. And now when I click the View button, what you're going to see is on the left-hand side we have these two items. We have both the basic page, which has our charts and tables on it, and we have our input page. If I click Edit, again I can use the toolbox to add more components to this particular page. So I'm going to click Toolbox, and for this one I'm going to use the data input controls. First of all, let's create a button. So a button, pretty much all it does is it invokes an API or script when clicked. So we're going to actually edit this button. The target of the button is what we want to invoke. So I want to invoke a script here, and I'm going to invoke this button script, so button.ps1. And if you recall, the button script takes a value parameter. And I can actually add parameters to the button itself. So we're going to do that. We're going to name this value, and I'll just name or provide the value of test to the value parameter. Some of the optional settings we can set for buttons are things like the text, run a script, and an icon that we want to put inside the button. So we can do, let's see, something fun. I don't know, that's not very fun. Exclamation. All right, so we'll save that, and you can see the button has updated with the text and the icon, and if I save that, what I can actually do is invoke this script. So now when I click this, you can see success was shown at the top there. If I go back to PowerShell Universal, go to Automation, Jobs, and we can look at the latest button run that was just run a few seconds ago. And if I go to job 6 here, you'll see that the value that I passed into that parameter is now shown inside of the script. So that means you could pass, whatever you want into whatever script you'd like, and based on that button click, the user could invoke that script really easily. You can also invoke APIs this way, so if there's like something else you wanted to invoke aside from a script where it kind of tracks the progress of those jobs, you could also do that. All right, let's make a little more complicated example, and that is via the form component. So the form component's a lot more customizable than the button. If we look at the properties of that, you're going to see that it has a lot more options. So what this is actually going to do, it's going to, execute a form, and let's see, please rate my script. And the result type is pretty much what happens after the form has executed. So if you are running a script and you want to display the pipeline output, what you can do is you can actually select table, which is what we're going to do. Showing output pretty much shows the output as the script is running. So if you have certain things that you want to print to the user just with write host or something like that, you can do that with show output. Show progress will actually show a progress bar if you're using write progress. So we have that in our script, and we're going to do that. Can reset actually allows the user to re-execute the form after it's executed once. If they reload the page, they'd be able to do the same thing, but this just provides a really nice little button that they can click. We're actually going to go to target now, and target is the API or script that we're going to execute. So I'm actually going to select script, and I want to execute the form.ps1 script. So you can also do things like selecting the run as user or specifying different environments for the script that you want to run. Next, I'm going to specify a field. So we have a rating field inside our, or rating parameter inside our script. And this is just going to match up to that. And what we can do here is we can select the type of input control. So we have a bunch of different ones. You can see we have checkbox, date, hidden, number, select, switch, text box, time, and rating. So a rating gives you the ability to select between 0 and 5 stars and then submit that as an int or a float to your script. You can also do things like providing help text and tooltips. Finally, we have some options for setting all the different text that is used throughout the form control. If you want to do a different language or change kind of what is stated inside the various states of a form, you can do that. And we're going to save this. So now you can see my form has been created. Execute a form. Please rate my script. It has a rating with a help message of a rating for my script. So we're actually going to save that. And now you can see that my form is here. Actually, one thing I want to do is just make this a little bigger because there's some stuff that this is going to output. So we'll save that. And then we're going to rate this script. Let's see. This script is a 3. And now when I save, you're going to see that it transitions into various states. So because I called read host inside this script, it's now waiting for feedback. So let's respond to that. What should we say? We'll just say hello. And now we'll click OK. And now it's going to transition into this kind of output view. And you can see here that there's the rating that we passed in and the hello that I typed in from read host. The progress bar on the top there, and then finally the output from get service is returned into a table that we can then view, which was just calling get service, which we piped to select object and just selected the name. So that's why the name is just shown in here. On the top right, you'll see that we have the go back button, which allows you to rerun that script, and we could again kind of step through the whole process of running that script again if we wanted to. So that's kind of the various input controls that we have. As you can see, the form is very customizable. You can add all kinds of controls and pass them to your scripts and kind of customize the experience the user has as they work through the actual script that you're running. In this final example, what we're going to actually do is create a page that uses variables. So using variables allows you to make dynamic pages kind of based on data that you would retrieve from APIs, the URLs, or information about the user. So we're actually going to create a new page, and we're just going to name this one custom, and we're actually going to specify a variable in the URL. So you can see we have custom / colon variable. And the colon pretty much specifies that that part of the route is a variable section of the route, which will show up as a variable inside our page. I'll kind of show you what that means now. So when we click OK, you can see we have our custom page created. And when we click View, it's going to load up our custom page. When we click Edit, you'll see on the right-hand side we have this Variables drop-down. And you can see that we have things like the page name, the full route that was specified, as well as the variable that was part of the route. So since we have just colon variable specified, that's why colon variable shows up here. But let me show you an example of how we could use that route variable to adjust how the page reacts. So I'm actually going to add an image in here, and I have a couple Imgur images, and instead of this one, I'm actually going to put this Imgur image in. So if I save this, you're going to see that we have this cartoon show up. And if I were to save that, that would show up. And if I go to like any random URL, you're going to see the same cartoon show up. But if I were to actually edit this to use that variable, so rather than having a static image here, I just specify $variable. So now, based on the route, it's actually going to change which image is shown. So if I save this, you can see that goes away because it doesn't know what that Imgur URL is. But if I put that correct ID inside the URL and hit enter, it's going to use that variable inside the URL for this page and show the correct one. As an example, I can put a different correct URL variable in there, and it's going to load a different cartoon. So in addition to being able to use route variables, you can also use page variables. So if you go to properties, you're going to see this data source section down here, and that is actually for specifying variables that we load from a data source for the entire page itself. So I'm actually going to select API variable, and that returns a hash table. So each property in the hash table will show up as a variable. So I have a single property in here called description, and when we save that, we save this, it updates the page, and we click edit. Now when we look at variables, you're going to see that we have a page variable that's shown up. So that was actually loaded from the API. That API had a hash table, and one of the properties of that hash table was description, and it had this value. Let's load a description. So now I can use that variable anywhere I want inside any component that accepts like a string. So I'm actually going to select toolbox. We're going to do data display alert. So we're going to move this alert over here. And since this has some text boxes, what we can actually do is use this inside here. So let's load a description is going to be replaced inside this description. We can set things like a warning. And now you can see let's load a description was actually placed in there instead of $description because that's a variable inside this page. So if we save that, you can see let's load a description is shown, and we have our URL-based image shown here. So you can kind of think of these variables similar to PowerShell variables, where you can also include other text sort of things. So you could say, hey there, and what it's actually going to do is concatenate those together. So it actually replaced that variable in there, and we also have hey there inside that alert. That's kind of similar to the URL that we used here. So just remember that you can use variables throughout all the different controls here. So kind of some examples you might see where you want to use a page like this is if you want to create something that manages a specific resource like a user, a group, a virtual machine, something like that. The URL could have the virtual machine's name, and then you could adjust the page based on that data. And you could have it execute forms or button clicks based on that particular route variable, and then update all the text that the user sees inside the page based on those variables. That kind of does it for our video here on PowerShell Universal pages. You can see pages are pretty powerful, and you don't need to write any PowerShell script to actually create the UI itself. It just invokes PowerShell scripts inside PowerShell Universal or APIs inside Universal. You can also invoke APIs outside of Universal if you do so choose. You can just type in the URL of those those APIs into targets and data sources. So if you have any questions about PowerShell Universal pages, feel free to open a thread on the forums or check out the documentation for PowerShell Universal pages at docs.powershelluniversal.com.